Okay, in this video we are continuing shading, so this is the third video total, second shading video. Make sure that you have a paper towel that you can use to protect your drawing as you're working on it, as well as your array of graphite pencils from your HB, the lightest, to your 6B, the darkest, and everything in between, and also an ebony pencil, and your graphite stick. In addition, make sure you've got your erasers with a nice point on them. Grab some new ones if yours are no longer pointy, and a larger eraser for bigger areas. And also make sure that you have at least one nicely folded up paper towel that you can use for blending. Notice this one is pretty clean, so when they get dirty you do need to either refold and use a different corner, or turn them inside out, or just make a new one. You might want to save the dirty ones because you can actually shade with the dirty paper towel as well, but you need some clean ones too. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to jump back into our shading. So I've got my primary reference here, which is this photograph that I took. But we also have these for reference, so we can think about, okay, in general, a cylinder is going to have a highlighted area, might get then a little bit darker even on that lighter side at the edge because it's curving back in space. So darker values will appear to go back in space. Then we've got the darker side, and unexpectedly we have this lighter area, so reflected light. And of course we've got our cast shadow, and then similar down here just in a pencil drawing. And of course we did our own value scale, so we can think about our white of the page as 5 and our darkest value as 1. Alright, so make sure that you pull up your own reference photo, and you can split screen with this video. So the key to drawing is really looking. So at this point I've kind of established what's going on in these different areas, and I'm just going to keep shading. So one area that I've started that I haven't gotten very far with is this area up above, so I'm going to continue that. We could make this whole area dark, but it's often more interesting to have gradations. So I'm starting this out dark for contrast, so I'm going to be using a darker value such as 4B or 6B, and which one you choose is up to you. I tend to like to use a lighter pencil and just press harder or layer the values more because they don't smudge as much later on. But maybe you want some more smudging so you can blend more easily. That's up to you. Notice the key here, I'm just working in really small marks. The tendency is we see a big area, we think, oh okay, I'm just going to go for it, make really big marks. But the bigger your mark, the more it tends to curve. That's the natural mark of your wrist. If you're making a really big mark, it's also the natural movement of your whole shoulder. But if I'm doing this area where I'm trying to create this flat space of the ground and this space up here, I kind of want those marks to be flat as well to support those spaces and forms. So we want them nice and consistent. So these small marks will help with that. It also helps create this really nice flat edge here. So just going little bit by little bit. You may not be able to draw a straight line without a ruler, totally fair, but if you go little bit by little bit, you can shade correctly along that straight line that you drew with your ruler. So we're reinforcing that with this crisp edge. So on the rubric, it talks about these crisp edges and contrast. This is the kind of thing we're looking for. Okay, so I'm starting out pretty dark. maybe, I think for this I'm going to get lighter and then get darker again. So for this large space, rather than making sloppy marks, I can actually use my graphite stick. So I've created this buffer zone first because I'm not going to be able to get into these little areas with the graphite stick, so you can make that as large as you need to. And notice I'm going right up to the area that I've already shaded carefully with the pencil. They are going to have a different texture, so I'm going to need to make sure that I overlap them in order to create this continuity between them. We do have different graphite sticks, some darker than others. I like to use the 2B so that I don't get a dark that is too dark that I didn't want by mistake. But if you then want to go a little bit darker, you could find one that is a little bit darker. All right, so as I keep going here, I like to turn my page as I work so that, yes, I have this, but I can also prevent smudging just by turning the page, and it's just more comfortable for me to work. So just expanding these areas here of my shading. So notice I don't want to ever have this outline be separate from the rest of the shading. There was an outline, but we kept it nice and light, and now we can no longer see it. We just have that hard edge. If you shade really hard for a little bit and then all of a sudden get lighter, then you'll be left with just a thick outline. So make sure this shading stays consistent, or you're gradually changing it. And so as I'm doing this, I can also come back and make sure these edges are crisp. So I just changed to my HB pencil because it has a little bit of a finer point on it. And I'm going to stop actually and sharpen it to get it even finer. So the softer pencils, as well as smudging more easily, they're just a little bit more dull. So I've overlapped the darker pencil and the finer point, lighter pencil here in order to make it both dark and that crisp edge that I wanted. So now switching back to my darker pencil as I expand that shading out. So I'm going over some of this area that I shaded before, getting it darker, creating more contrast. So we want to have plenty of contrast in this. So one thing that you're going to see that I'll be doing as I go, I'm actually going to exaggerate what I see in the photograph. So if you're a really great photographer or get lucky, you may be able to get a photograph that has amazing lighting, just as dramatic as this drawing. But I actually did a lot to set this up and tweak this photo and had really good lighting, and it's still not as dramatic. But what you want to do is exaggerate. So just like any art medium does, we exaggerate for effect. So a movie, that's realistic, that's based on, I don't know, let's say Grey's Anatomy, a show about doctors set in a hospital. All those exciting things might happen in a hospital, but on Grey's Anatomy, they're all happening at once. So you exaggerate to make it more interesting. Just watching people's lives unfold in real time would be pretty boring, but for a TV show or a movie, we exaggerate. Same thing with our drawing. So contrast. or making the contrast high. All right, so I'm going to keep going with this edge here. So I'm going to shade all along this edge, and then I'm going to connect to this background. So I'm going to turn off the camera, do a little bit of that off screen. As you're doing this on your own off screen, make sure that you're doing these 1/8 of an inch small marks. So I'm not going down the whole side with a line first. I'm just going little bit by little bit. All right, keep it up. Okay, so I've done some of this shading off screen. Notice I still have this area that sort of looks like a thick outline. So I need to continue working to make sure that I connect this shading so that I have this gradual transition. So using my darker pencil, notice these marks are still only about 1/8 of an inch. And just connecting these, making sure that any of these areas where they look a little bit darker, that I continue that shading gradually. And then periodically sit back, maybe hold your paper out and just see how that's really looking. So when I sit back and do that, then I can see, okay, there are still these areas where it's feeling more like this outline rather than it's all connected. So then I go back and I continue to focus on those areas. All right, so I'm thinking about making this go from dark to kind of medium and then maybe darker again, but I'm going to hold off because I want to work on the whole drawing at once, and I'll make the final decision on that after I've completed more of the drawing. So some of the things that we were working on that we can come back to working on now, we've got this area in here that we still need to complete shading across. So darkest here and then getting lighter as we move across. That's an area that I'm going to keep working on. And I'm also going to keep working on this center section here. However, again, in the interest of making sure that we're working on the whole thing, I also am going to create this shadow here, the cast shadow on the table. So let's work on that a little bit now since we haven't before. So this is going to be a pretty dark area, so I can go a little bit lighter with this cast shadow. And one of the things that I'll do before I start shading it, I'm actually going to erase the outlines, because shadows don't have outlines, so these lines are going to become soft edges. So I can still see where they were, but they're so light that they're not going to show up underneath my shading. So we don't want to see lines here in the end. All right, so I'm going to shade a little bit more now on this bottom part of the cylinder before I do this cast shadow. So as I do that, I make sure that I'm maintaining that curve that I want. And I'm remembering, okay, it's going to actually get darker as it moves across this for a bit into this darkest area. So really making sure to get this edge really nice and crisp and exactly where I want it. So as you're shading, you are still drawing, you're still looking, you're still thinking. This is where your drawing goes from pretty good to, okay, I'm getting these edges exactly where I want them, which you can do because you're going in these really small little increments. All right. And I might want to make that a little bit darker too as I go. All right, now leaving off from there, we were doing that in part for this context for the shadow. So now I'm going to work on that cast shadow. I'm going to use a 2B or even an HB here because this is a fairly light shadow. And as I'm doing that, I see, okay, I actually need to make this area over here a little bit darker. So even though we have reflected light on this side, we also have to consider the context. And that may get a little bit lighter than as we move up. But here it's got to be darker so that we can have a shadow that reads as a shadow, the cast shadow, and the side of the cylinder still stands out with contrast against it. So this is what I was talking about earlier about exaggerating for effect. So you need to have contrast, and that contrast is especially along edges of forms like this. So you need to be able to see your form. Okay. So notice I'm shading in the same direction as the edge of the cylinder because I want to make sure that we keep a nice, really firm edge here on the cylinder. So then I'm going to switch directions as we come around this curve. And here I'm still seeing some sort of like little extra lines here, so I'll get rid of those before I add my shading. So I'm going to make sure that my cylinder has a really nice, crisp, firm edge. So I'm going over that a little bit, and then I'm shading right next to it lightly, right up to this point where the shadow starts. And here I'm going to shade over where that edge was, but I'm leaving this kind of rough. So just like you did on the outside edge of that gradation, we're making that kind of rough. So to exaggerate, I'm going to exaggerate just a little. I don't know if it's going to show, but I'm not making it one edge. It's actually coming out here and then in and then out a little bit because I want to get a soft edge here. All right, now once I've created, again, this little buffer zone here, I'm going to switch and have my marks switch to horizontal. So I'm going over that area that I started as vertical. And if I have sort of an area in here where you can see that they are looking different, I then make my marks even smaller right there to make sure that that transitions smoothly. But using the direction of the marks, horizontal marks, really small, flat, not distracting, but that's just going to help reinforce that this is the ground. So when you're working on a ground, especially a flat tabletop like this, horizontal marks will help you create that illusion that that area is flat. So, and I can create that too here along the edge. So as I continue this edge, now using these horizontal marks to create that flat effect. And I can, again, switch to using my graphite stick if I want to. Right, and I'm going to then connect these. So I'm going over this area that has some of the graphite stick shading, and vice versa. I went over the marks where I started with the graphite stick. To make sure that this transition is smooth. And then blending. So be very careful in this area. I want to make sure that my blending does not go into the cylinder. So I can go up to that edge of the cylinder. But I'm not going to go inside it. And I keep working on that. Now, if I don't get that smooth transition that I want, I can always go back and I could erase if I don't like how this is looking later. But for now, I'm going to keep going because it's all about the context. And we're going to pause the video and continue in the next video. So before I do, we'll get a good look at how this is looking.